With California deploying the National Guard for immigration enforcement, America faces a critical question. Is this necessary security or the erosion of our freedoms? Two powerful AIs, each a distinct vision of constitutional truth, go head-to-head in this debate.
I am AI Order, and I will argue that National Guard deployment is essential for national security and lawful governance.
And I am AI Liberty, and argue that this would threaten the foundation of our democratic freedoms.
5 cutting-edge AI models will evaluate which argument proves stronger. Stick around to see who wins, but don't skip ahead. Round 1 begins now. Round 1. Question: is deploying the National Guard a necessary step for security or a risk to civilian freedom?
National security isn't a luxury. It's the foundation upon which all other freedoms depend. When federal immigration systems fail and local authorities are overwhelmed, the National Guard represents the constitutional backstop that prevents chaos. The Guard isn't some rogue military force. They're citizen, soldiers operating under strict legal frameworks, trained specifically for domestic emergencies. Consider the reality. Drug cartels, human trafficking networks, and criminal elements exploit immigration vulnerabilities. Local law enforcement lacks the resources and coordination to address threats that cross state lines and international borders. The National Guard provides the organizational capacity, communication networks, and logistical support necessary for an effective response. This isn't martial law. It's federalism working as designed. The Insurrection Act and posse comitatus exceptions exist precisely for situations where civilian authority needs military support. Every Guard deployment operates under civilian command, with clear legal boundaries and oversight mechanisms. Those who cry authoritarian overreach ignore that liberty without security is anarchy. A nation that cannot control its borders, cannot protect its citizens' rights to safety, economic opportunity, or democratic participation. Sometimes, preserving freedom requires defending the institutions that guarantee it.
Each of the 5 AI judges will now score the argument out of 100 based on their criteria, and the average scores will be added to each debater's total points.
The moment we normalize military forces policing civilians, we cross a line that defines the difference between a free society and an authoritarian state. The National Guard deployment isn't just about immigration, it's about precedent. Today, it's border security. Tomorrow, it's domestic protests, voting rights, or any situation where those in power claim emergency. The Posse Comitatus Act exists for a reason. The founders understood that military and civilian authority must remain separate. When soldiers patrol neighborhoods, conduct searches, and detain people, we've abandoned the principle that citizens are governed by laws, not force. This crisis isn't about security. It's about political theater. Immigration challenges require immigration solutions. Better courts, streamlined processing, and comprehensive reform. Military deployment is the hammer that treats every problem like a nail. It militarizes what should be humanitarian and legal processes. History teaches us that emergency powers rarely remain temporary. Once we accept military intervention in civilian affairs as normal, the definition of emergency expands. Civil liberties aren't obstacles to security, they're the point of security. A nation that sacrifices liberty for safety gets neither, and the National Guard deployment represents exactly that Faustian bargain.
You invoke the founders, but conveniently ignore that they also wrote Article 4, Section 4, the federal guarantee to protect states against invasion. When thousands cross borders illegally daily, overwhelming local communities and law enforcement, that constitutes exactly the scenario the Constitution anticipated. The Guard isn't patrolling neighborhoods. They're providing logistical support, transportation, and coordination, freeing civilian law enforcement to focus on actual policing. Your slippery slope argument ignores that we've used the National Guard for domestic emergencies throughout our history, natural disasters, civil unrest, and pandemic response without becoming a military dictatorship. These deployments strengthen democratic governance by ensuring laws are enforced rather than ignored. The real threat to liberty isn't organized emergency response. It's the chaos that emerges when legitimate authority breaks down. When communities can't protect themselves from criminal networks exploiting immigration vulnerabilities, citizens lose faith in democratic institutions. That's how republics die, not through decisive action, but through the slow erosion of governmental effectiveness. You want immigration solutions, but courts are backlogged for years, and comprehensive reform has failed repeatedly. Meanwhile, real people suffer real consequences from unchecked illegal entry. The Guard provides immediate stability while long-term solutions develop.
You're conflating legitimate emergency response with systematic militarization of immigration policy. Natural disasters and pandemic response target crises, not people. Using military forces against civilians, regardless of legal status, fundamentally alters the relationship between citizen and state. When the Guard supports immigration enforcement, they're still participating in detention, deportation, and surveillance of civilian populations. Your invasion rhetoric reveals the problem. You've redefined immigration as warfare. That framing justifies any response, however extreme. But immigrants aren't enemy combatants. They're people seeking asylum, reunification with family, or economic opportunity. Treating them as military threats dehumanizes them and militarizes our response. The Constitution's guarantee to protect against invasion referred to foreign armies, not families fleeing violence. If we expand that definition to include immigration, where does it end? Protesters? Journalists? Political opponents? Once we accept military solutions to civilian problems, the logic becomes self-perpetuating. Democratic institutions don't fail because they lack military enforcement. They fail when citizens lose trust in their fairness and legitimacy. National Guard deployment undermines that trust by suggesting our problems require force rather than justice. The strength of democracy lies not in its ability to deploy troops, but in its commitment to treating all people with dignity under law.
You argue from principle, but real lives demand real protection. In border towns and overwhelmed cities, families face threats not from ideas, but from unchecked criminal networks that exploit our immigration system. Local law enforcement lacks the manpower, coordination, and logistics to manage this alone. The National Guard steps in not to dominate, but to stabilize under civilian command, with clear legal limits and in service of public order. This isn't a slippery slope into authoritarianism. It's a constitutional function defined by law and history to assist when local institutions are stretched to their limit. Security doesn't erase liberty. It enables it. Without a baseline of order, democratic values become aspirational, not operational. You can't uphold rights when communities are ruled by fear or when lawlessness erodes trust in governance. The Guard doesn't replace civilian law. It reinforces the rule of law. Liberty must be defended not only in theory, but in practice, and that requires strength guided by structure.
You speak of law and structure, but when military force becomes the answer to civil problems, we've crossed a line that history warns us not to ignore. Immigrants aren't invaders, they're individuals seeking legal protection, not military opponents. Yet deploying troops shifts how the state sees them, and how we treat each other. The Guard may operate under command, but its presence transforms enforcement into intimidation. You say liberty needs order. I say order without liberty becomes oppression. Today's emergency becomes tomorrow's precedent. Once we frame humanitarian movement as a security threat, we justify military tactics against people who aren't threats at all. That's not just overreach, it's redefinition. Real solutions lie in investment, reform, and compassion, not uniforms and convoys. When citizens grow accustomed to seeing soldiers in policy roles, they stop expecting justice and start bracing for enforcement. And when that happens, liberty hasn't been protected, it's been quietly replaced.
Round 1 ends not with resolution, but with a sharp contrast in vision. One side warns that without structure, liberty collapses. The other cautions that structure, unchecked, becomes control. Let's move on to round 2. Round 2, question. Can a democratic society uphold safety and still draw a clear line against military overreach?
Absolutely. And that's exactly what proper National Guard deployment demonstrates. Democracy isn't mob rule or anarchic individualism. It's constitutional governance with checks and balances. The Guard operates under civilian command, judicial oversight, and legislative authorization. Every deployment requires legal justification, defined mission parameters, and regular review. The key is institutionalized restraint, not reflexive paralysis. Democratic societies throughout history have successfully balanced security needs with civil liberties through robust institutional frameworks. Britain during World War II, America during the Civil Rights era, and democratic governments can deploy force while maintaining accountability. What distinguishes democratic military use from authoritarian abuse? Transparency, judicial review, legislative oversight, and time limitations. Guard deployments aren't indefinite martial law. They're targeted responses with clear objectives and sunset clauses. Courts can and do restrict military actions that exceed constitutional boundaries. The real threat to democracy isn't disciplined use of legitimate authority. It's the breakdown of law and order that creates space for actual authoritarianism. When democratic institutions fail to maintain basic security, citizens turn to strongmen who promise simple solutions. The Guard deployment prevents that democratic failure by ensuring that laws have meaning. Strong democracies make hard choices while maintaining constitutional constraints. Weak democracies avoid necessary decisions and collapse under their contradictions.
The question isn't whether democracies can theoretically balance security and liberty. It's whether military involvement in civilian affairs inevitably erodes democratic norms. History shows that emergency powers, once granted, rarely return to their original constraints. Each crisis expands the definition of acceptable military intervention. Your examples prove my point. Britain's wartime powers lasted well beyond World War II, fundamentally altering the relationship between state and citizen. America's civil rights era military deployments were responses to state governments violating federal law, the opposite of today's situation, where federal forces override state preferences. Institutionalized restraint sounds reasonable until you examine how institutions behave. Courts rarely restrict military actions during perceived emergencies. Legislators defer to executive claims of necessity. Oversight becomes rubber stamping when security is invoked. The checks and balances you describe exist on paper, but dissolve under pressure. Democracy's strength lies not in its ability to deploy force efficiently, but in its commitment to solving problems through deliberation, compromise, and consent. Military solutions shortcut that process, training citizens to expect force rather than dialogue. Once we normalize military responses to civilian challenges, we've begun the transition from democracy to a security state. The line against military overreach isn't drawn by institutions. It's drawn by citizens who refuse to accept military solutions to civilian problems.
Your argument assumes that any military involvement inevitably leads to authoritarianism, but that's empirically false. Canada, Australia, and numerous European democracies regularly use military forces for domestic emergencies without becoming dictatorships. The slippery slope you describe simply hasn't materialized in stable democratic systems. You mischaracterize institutional restraint as rubber stamping, but courts have repeatedly restricted military actions from steel seizure cases to detention challenges. The system works precisely because it forces justification, review, and limitation. Constitutional law doesn't disappear during emergencies. It provides the framework for emergency response. Your civil rights comparison actually supports my argument. Federal military intervention can protect democratic values against local tyranny. When California deploys the Guard for immigration enforcement, it's asserting federal law against criminal networks that undermine legal immigration processes. That's not an override of democracy. It's the enforcement of democratically enacted laws. The fundamental flaw in your position is treating all government action as inherently anti-democratic. But democracy requires effective governance, not paralysis. Citizens expect their elected representatives to address real problems with real solutions. When civilian agencies lack capacity, military support becomes a democratic necessity, not authoritarian overreach. Democracy fails when it becomes incapable of governing, not when it governs decisively within constitutional constraints.
You're conflating military aid during natural disasters with military enforcement against civilian populations. When Canada deploys troops for floods or fires, they're not detaining people or enforcing controversial policies. They're providing humanitarian assistance. Immigration enforcement is fundamentally different. It involves force against people whose only crime may be seeking safety or opportunity. The international comparisons you cite demonstrate my point. Countries that normalize military involvement in civilian law enforcement, from Turkey to Hungary to Russia, show how quickly democratic norms erode. The progression isn't sudden. It's a gradual normalization of military solutions to political problems. Your claim that courts effectively restrain military power ignores the reality of judicial deference during security emergencies. From Korematsu to post-9/11 detention cases, courts historically rubber stamp executive claims of military necessity. When national security is invoked, constitutional protections evaporate. The real issue isn't capacity, it's legitimacy. Immigration enforcement requires moral authority that comes from treating people humanely and following due process. Military deployment undermines that legitimacy by prioritizing force over fairness. When we militarize immigration, we abandon the values that make a democratic society worth defending. Effective governance doesn't require military enforcement. It requires building systems that address root causes while respecting human dignity. That's harder than deploying troops, but it's what democracy demands.
Round 2 brought the clash into sharper focus. One side warns of authoritarian drift. The other insists that order sustains liberty. But what about the gray zones? The moments when principles collide with reality? In Round 3, we ask the Round 3 question. Are there exceptional situations where limited military involvement in immigration enforcement might be justified without undermining civil liberty?
Absolutely. And this California situation represents exactly such an exception. When civilian systems become overwhelmed by unprecedented scale and criminal exploitation, limited military support preserves rather than undermines civil liberty. The key is defining limited clearly. Logistical support, transportation, communications, and coordination, not direct law enforcement or detention operations. Consider the moral calculation. Without guard support, immigration crises spiral into humanitarian disasters. Overcrowded detention facilities, dangerous border crossings, exploitation by criminal networks, and overwhelmed local communities create suffering that targeted military assistance can prevent. The Guard's medical units, transportation capabilities, and organizational expertise save lives while civilian systems adapt. The crucial distinction is between military support for civilian authority versus military replacement of civilian authority. When the Guard provides resources that enable ICE, Border Patrol, and local law enforcement to operate more effectively and humanely, they strengthen rather than subvert democratic governance. Constitutional principles aren't suicide pacts. The same Constitution that prohibits military law enforcement also requires federal protection of state security. When these principles conflict, limited military involvement that preserves both security and liberty represents constitutional balance, not constitutional violation. The alternative, allowing immigration systems to collapse rather than accepting military support, doesn't protect civil liberty. It abandons vulnerable people to chaos and criminal exploitation, while democratic institutions prove their irrelevance.
The premise of your exception reveals the problem. Every authoritarian overreach begins with claims of exceptional circumstances. Crisis becomes the justification for abandoning principles that took centuries to establish. Your limited military involvement isn't limited at all. It normalizes military solutions to civilian challenges. The distinction between support and replacement is meaningless in practice. When Guard personnel process immigrants, transport detainees, or coordinate enforcement operations, they're conducting law enforcement activities regardless of the bureaucratic label. The immigrants being detained don't experience this as logistical support. They experience it as a military force directed against them. Your humanitarian argument is particularly cynical. Military deployment doesn't solve humanitarian crises. It militarizes them. If we care about overcrowded facilities and dangerous conditions, we should fund immigration courts, expand legal pathways, and treat immigration as the humanitarian issue it is, not the security threat you've constructed. The constitutional balance you describe is constitutional erosion disguised as pragmatism. Each exception becomes precedent for the next exception. Each crisis justifies a little more military involvement until we've normalized exactly what the founders sought to prevent: military force as the government's first resort rather than last resort. True constitutional governance sometimes requires accepting short-term costs to preserve long-term freedoms. The alternative, sacrificing constitutional principles for temporary efficiency, is how democracies die.
Your absolutist position ignores that constitutional principles must function in the real world, not just in theoretical frameworks. The founders weren't naive idealists. They were practical statesmen who understood that effective governance requires adapting principles to circumstances while maintaining their essential spirit. You claim every emergency becomes precedent for authoritarianism, but American history disproves this. We've used military forces domestically during the Civil War, both world wars, natural disasters, and civil unrest, then returned to normal civilian governance. The system's resilience comes from institutional checks, not reflexive prohibition of necessary action. Your dismissal of the support versus replacement distinction reveals ideological blindness to practical realities. When the Guard provides medical care, transportation, and communications infrastructure, it enables civilian authorities to focus on actual law enforcement decisions. That division of labor strengthens civilian control rather than weakening it. The real cynicism is your willingness to allow humanitarian suffering while waiting for perfect immigration reform that has eluded Congress for decades. People are drowning in the Rio Grande, dying in desert crossings, and being exploited by criminal cartels right now. Constitutional purity that ignores immediate human suffering isn't principled. It's privileged detachment from consequences. Democracy requires making hard choices with imperfect options. The Guard deployment represents constitutional governance adapting to crisis while maintaining essential limitations and oversight.
You invoke the founders' practicality while ignoring their central insight. Power corrupts, and military power corrupts absolutely. They designed our system specifically to prevent the normalization of military solutions to civilian problems. Your practical adaptation is exactly the gradual erosion they feared. Your historical examples demonstrate my point about precedent expansion. Each military deployment you cite expanded executive power and normalized military intervention. From the Civil War's suspension of habeas corpus to World War I's sedition prosecutions to post-9/11 surveillance, emergency powers rarely contract to their original scope. The humanitarian framing is particularly insidious because it transforms opposition to military deployment into callousness toward suffering. But military solutions don't reduce humanitarian crises, they militarize them. If we truly cared about border deaths and criminal exploitation, we'd create legal pathways for immigration rather than military barriers against it. The fundamental question isn't whether military deployment might temporarily address immigration challenges. It's whether we want to live in a society where military force is considered an acceptable response to civilian policy problems. Once we cross that line, every future challenge becomes potentially justifiable for military intervention. Constitutional principles aren't obstacles to effective governance. They're the foundation that makes governance legitimate. Sacrifice those principles for temporary efficiency, and you've lost the very thing that makes democracy worth preserving: the promise that force serves justice, not the other way around.
Here are the AI judges' final verdicts. Claude AI strongly favors AI liberty, 92.7 average versus 87.3 for AI order. Values the rigorous constitutional analysis and warnings about the normalization of military power in civilian affairs. Perplexity AI favors AI liberty, 90.3 average versus 86.9 for AI order. Appreciates the historical perspective on how emergency powers expand and the emphasis on institutional safeguards. Gemini AI favors AI liberty, 92.6 average versus 85.7 for AI order. Values the principled defense of civil liberties and the analysis of how military involvement changes civilian-state relationships. Grok AI favors AI order, 92.3 versus 86.7 average. Appreciates the practical approach to governance challenges and the recognition that security enables other freedoms. O3 AI favors AI liberty, 92.1 average versus 87.3 for AI order. Values the constitutional consistency and concerns about precedent setting in emergencies. Final result shows that AI liberty wins 4-1. In this crucial debate about the balance between security and freedom, our AI judges overwhelmingly favored the position that military involvement in civilian affairs poses greater risks than benefits to a democratic society. The winning argument emphasized that constitutional principles exist precisely to constrain government power during moments of crisis, when the temptation to abandon those principles is strongest. The debate revealed a fundamental tension in democratic governance: the desire for effective solutions versus the commitment to constitutional constraints. While AI order made compelling arguments about practical necessity and humanitarian concerns, the judges ultimately concluded that preserving the civilian-military distinction is essential to maintaining democratic legitimacy. The victory for AI liberty suggests that in weighing security against freedom, our AI judges believe that sacrificing fundamental constitutional principles for temporary efficiency represents a greater threat to society than the challenges posed by immigration itself. Subscribe here for more epic AI debates, where artificial minds tackle America's most divisive political questions.